Lecture number 8. So this is plan of the lecture: interrupt system, interruption depth, hardware and software interrupts, chains in the limited system for determining the priority of an interrupt request, and interrupt handling in a personal computer. So, an interrupt is the termination of the execution of the current command or the current sequence of commands for processing some event by a special program, an interrupt handler with a subsequent return to the execution of the interrupt program. The event can be triggered by a special situation during program execution or by a signal from an external device. An interrupt is used to quickly react the processor to special situations that occur during program execution and interaction with external device. The interrupt mechanism is provided by the appropriate hardware and software of the computer. Any exception that causes on interrupt is accompanied by a signal called an interrupt request. So, interrupt request from external devices enter the processor via special lines, and requests arising during program execution come directly from inside the microprocessor. The interrupt handling mechanism for both types are similar. This is performing an interrupt on the computer. Consider the functioning of a computer when an interrupt request signal appears, relying mainly on the processing of hardware interrupts. In this figure, an interrupt in the computer, TP, the processor response time to an interrupt request, and TC, time of saving the state of the interrupt program and calling the interrupt handler. TB, recovery time of the interrupt program. After the appearance of the interrupt request signal, the computer proceeds to the execution of the program, the interrupt handler. So the handler performs the actions that are required due to an exceptional situation that has arisen. For example, such a situation might be a key press on a computer keyboard. Then the handler should pass the code of the pressed key from the keyboard controller to the processor and possibly parse the code. At the end of the handler's work, control is transferred to the interrupted program. So what is response time? Response time is the time between the appearance of the interrupt request signal and the beginning of the execution of the interrupt program. And also we can call interrupt handler in the event that this interrupt is allowed to service. The response time depends on the moment when the processor detects the presence of interrupt request. I will repeat again. The response time depends on the moment when the processor detects the presence of interrupt requests. Interrupt requests can be pulled either at the end of the execution of the next stage of the command. For example, reading the command, reading the first operand, reading the second operand, and etc. Or after the compilation of each program command. Next is interruption depth. Interruption depth is the maximum number of programs that can interrupt each other. So the interrupt depth is usually the same as the number of priority levels recognized by the interrupt system. The operation of the interrupt system at different interrupt depth is shown in this figure. This assumes that as the interrupt request number increases, its priority increases. So performing processing in response to state change in the through interrupt between SPU when using interrupts and the GPIO. GPIO inputs value change from 0 to 1 binary codes, performing processing in response to state change. Interrupts are divided into hardware and software. Программные и аппаратные прерывания. So, what is hardware interrupts? Аппаратное прерывание. Hardware interrupts are used to organize communication with external devices. То есть аппаратное прерывание используется для организации communication, взаимодействия с external devices, внешними устройствами. Hardware interrupt requests are sent to special inputs of the microprocessor. То есть запрос аппаратных прерываний поступает на специальные входы microprocessor. То есть они бывают, they are maskable and non-maskable, маскируемые и не маскируемые. Maskable, which can be masked by computer software. And non-maskable, the request from which cannot be masked in this way. And what about software interrupts? Программные прерывания are triggered by the following situations. То есть следующая ситуация. For example, a special case, особые случаи. Case that arose during the execution of a command and interferes with the normal continuation of the program. Overflow, переполнение, violation of memory protection, нарушение защиты памяти, lack of desired page in RAM, отсутствие нужной страницы в RAM, and и так далее, etc. The presence in the program of a special command interrupt, which is usually used by the programmer when making calls to special functions of the operating system for information input-output. And each interrupt request in the computer is assigned a number or interrupt type used to determine the address of the interrupt handler. When an interrupt request arrives, the computer performs the following sequence of actions. There are 7 steps. The first step, Determination of the highest priority and must interrupt requests. If several requests were received simultaneously. The second step, determining the type of the selected request. Saving the current state of the command counter and the flag register. Determining the address of the interrupt handler by the type of interrupt, um, and transferring control to the first command of this handler. Fifth, execution of an interrupt handler program. Restoration of the saved values of the command counter and the register flags of the interrupt program. And the last one, continuation of the interrupt program. Steps from first to four are performed automatically by the hardware when an interrupt request occurs. Stage 6 is also performed in hardware by a return command from the interrupt handler. The program's task is compose an interrupt handler program that would perform actions related to the appearance of a request of this type and place the address of the beginning of this program in a special table of interrupt addresses. A handler program, as a rule, should begin with saving the state of those processor registers that it will change and end with restoring the state of this register. The handler program must terminate with a special command that instructs the processor to return to the interrupted program. So, conclusion. Basically, a single computer can perform only one computer instruction at a time. But because it can be interrupted, it can take turns in which programs or sets of instructions that it performs. This is known as multitasking. It allows the user to do a number of different things at the same time. The computer simply takes turns managing the programs that the user starts. And the computer operates at speeds that make it seem as though all of the user's tasks are being performed at the same time. And the computer's operating system is good at using little pauses in operations and the user takes time to work on other programs. In general, there are hardware interrupts and software interrupts. A hardware interrupt occurs, for example, when an input-output operation is completed, such as reading some data into the computer from a tape drive. And the software interrupt occurs when an application program terminates or requested certain services from the operating system. In a personal computer, a hardware interrupt request has a value that associates